Okay, so I should actually have a dot 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 on the left-hand side to indicate it goes on forever in that direction as well. So there is a smallest whole number, there is a smallest natural number, but there is not a quote-unquote smallest integer. So a lot of times what I like to think of the integers as the positive and negative whole numbers. Okay. So every number has basically a size and a direction. So one of the things you can think about with the positive and negative numbers is something about, like, I don't know, having assets or debts, something that you have or you have a lack of. But there's also, like, in the case of something like elevation or coordinates or temperature, a negative doesn't necessarily mean that you have a lack of something, right? Negative 2 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't mean you're missing temperature. All it is just a place on the scale of temperature. And so zero in that case is not like a lack of temperature. Zero just means it's just some place on the scale. And so 0 is sort of like the quote unquote center, and it doesn't always have to be thought of as the center, but it is kind of a center value in our number line. And so we could think of the direction as whether we move in the positive direction or in the negative direction. So, and then the size would be how far we move away from 0, okay? So if I was to put 0 something like this, then we might say, I'm just gonna label this by 5s. Just to get my bearing here. Okay, so this would be the positive direction going to the right, and the negative direction going to the left. And I want to just kind of point out that the positive direction and negative direction are, in fact, arbitrary. It's kind of arbitrary that we even make this horizontal number line. A lot of times with temperatures, you might think of the number lines as being vertical. But this is just kind of a convention. It is a practice that a lot of people choose. And so, but you can make your number line in any orientation as long as you have it numbered in a way that everybody will understand exactly where, like, 3 is. So in this case, we have the positive direction going to the right and the negative direction going to the left. And we would say, like, the number 15 is somehow, the size is 15 here. And the number negative 12, that means I go 12 units to the left of the 0, or in the negative direction from 0. Then I would say the size of that number is 12. Okay? So you might think of, like, there's each number has a size and a direction. So, negative 12, the direction is in the negative direction, and the size is 12 units. And in this sense, you can talk about comparing sizes of numbers, like negative 1,000 is in some ways a bigger number than positive 3, just because, like, if you're thinking about having assets and debts, if I have a debt of $1,000 and I have $3 in the bank, my debt is larger than my set of assets. And so that's where we might compare the sizes of these numbers, which is different from saying less or greater than. And that when we talk about numbers being less or greater than other numbers, we're strictly talking about how they're ordered on the number line. So the size of a number is also called its absolute value. And sometimes it's also called magnitude. Okay, that is another word that is used mathematically. It's also a word that's used in English. And so we denote the absolute value with this sort of vertical bars. So in the two examples that I lined up in the front, the absolute value or the size of 15 is 15 because this number 15 is 15 units away from 0. And the absolute value or size of negative 12 is 12 because this number, negative 12, is 12 units away from the 0. Okay, it is 12 units big in the negative direction. If you ever use any typewriter-based calculators, such as like spreadsheets or even using like Google as a calculator, then a lot of times they'll use ABS as an abbreviation. And if you want to use these are like called pipe bars, then a lot of times that is, it's above the backslash, which is oftentimes above the return key on a keyboard. So the return key will often have something like a backslash, and then if you hit shift, it'll have that vertical bar. Sometimes it'll actually show this two vertical bar thing. I don't know why. I'm sure there's some history to it. Okay, so the direction of the number. So this is where we talk about positive and negatives. Okay, and so we will also call this its sign. S-I-G-N, sign. Okay, so if I talk about the sign of the number 15, if I want to ask what sign is that, you would say it's a positive number. And what sign does the number negative 12 has? You would say it's negative. Okay, so we could say, and this is not really notation that is commonly used, but so if you have so sign of 15 is positive and sign of negative 12 is negative. And so don't take too much weight into this, but a lot of times if you have to calculate something, if you want to calculate something with numbers and it matters whether you have a positive number or a negative number, a lot of times people will put positive 1 and negative 1 as the sign value. And then the sign of 0 is neither positive nor negative. So it would be 0. So again, so this is not all that important to get hung up on, but we have a tendency to denote the signs with this plus sign or a minus sign. So to say 15, a lot of what that really means is positive 15. And if there's ever any question about whether you mean a positive 15 or a negative 15, it's okay to actually write that plus there just for clarification to make sure that everybody you're talking to understands that you mean a positive 15. So that is the notation for saying which direction the number goes in. And then negative 12, we pretty much never write negative numbers without writing that negative sign. So that minus sign there really gives you the indication of its sign. So this means that you go in the negative direction from 0. Okay. So two numbers are called opposites if they have the same size, the same absolute value, but they exist on opposite sides of 0. They're like mirror images of each other. So, so let me write that. Two numbers are called opposites if they have same absolute value, but opposite directions. That's a little bit faster. So, for example, 3 and negative 3 are opposites. So their absolute value, they both have a distance of 3 from 0, but they're in opposite directions. Also, negative 38. If you could pause for a moment, what is the opposite of negative 38? It would be positive 38. So again, I'm not going to put all of the tick marks here, but they are the same distance. It is worth noting here that these are two different scales that I'm looking at between these two number lines. Okay, so this might be a little bit confusing, but after you get used to it, you'll see we denote the opposite of a number with that negative sign. Okay, so that negative sign, we actually have a few different uses for that symbol. It can be the operation minus, as in like 7 minus 3. It can also indicate the sign of a number, as in negative 12, that we use that same symbol to indicate that it's 12 in the negative direction. But we can also use it as an indication of the opposite. So the opposite, if I write the opposite of 3, what is the opposite of 3? Well, it's negative 3. Okay, and writing this down as it's written doesn't actually convey the meaning of what I actually said out loud. The opposite of 3 equals -3. So I'm using the same symbol in both cases, but I'm reading it as the opposite of 3 equals -3. Okay? And similarly, the opposite of -3, what is the opposite of -3? The opposite of -3 is 3. Okay? These are kind of important to note, and it might seem very confusing, but again, as you kind of do this a little bit more, like if you kind of accept that it does actually make sense to use the same symbol for all 3 of these different places, you'll start to see how it makes sense, and it'll get less confusing as you continue on. So if it feels confusing right now, allow yourself to feel that confusion, but don't get too hung up on feeling confused by it. Okay. The opposite of 23, you should get, it is -23. The opposite of -7, let's just draw the picture. So here's, if I go 23 to the right of 0, or 23 to the left of 0, those are the same absolute value but different signs. And then there is, let me just put this over further. The opposite of -7. So that goes in this direction. So if I go 7 in the other direction, I'm going to get +7. Okay, so name 2 numbers that have the same absolute value but different signs. There's many, many numbers you can choose. Same absolute value but different signs. So these should be same absolute values but different signs. These should be opposite numbers. So like 3 and -3, or 281, -281 and +281. Okay? So any 2 numbers that you choose to write there are, as long as they have the same absolute value, but they go in opposite directions from 0. So those are opposites. Name 2 numbers that have the same sign but different absolute values. So if I was to write, for example, -7, and what's another number that has the same sign as -7 but a different absolute value? Well, in this case, there's infinitely many numbers you could choose. So, for example, -15. As long as it is in the negative direction, then it can go with -7. Or if I was to list 1, then what's another number that has a same sign as 1 but different absolute value? So you can list any positive number. So, for example, 11, or 38, or 5,000. Okay, so when we write this notation, this is read as the absolute value of -3 or as the size or magnitude okay, so take a minute. What is the absolute value of -3? It is 3, and why is that? So the magnitude is how big the number is, or you can also think of this as how far that number is away from 0 on the number line. So we can write 3 is because -3 is 3 units from 0 on the number line. Okay, so 0, 1, 2, -3. So that is 3 units there. And just a little reminder, when we're talking about the number of units on a number line, I'm talking about the spaces, not the tick marks. There are 3 spaces. It's like a distance. Okay. So the absolute value of 17 is 17 because, let's see if you can fill this in. So 17 is 17 units away from 0 on the number line. So if I put 17 there, this is 17 units. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make a separate video for the adding and subtracting of integers.